the screen. Good morning, everybody. Oh, give me a second. I can just before I start. You know, there are the translation word in the lower. Sorry, I have my eye in Spanish. Okay, but good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third day of the fantastic conference that we have had. The last 2 days, the presentation has been just fantastic. This session is called Migratory Currents Impacting the Young People Cross-National Movement, the case of Latin American Caribbean migrants. So, since the majority of the presenters are Spanish speaker, I will switch to Spanish and then I will switch back to English when Dr. San Bernard presentation. So, buenos días a todos. Me da mucho gusto de recibirlos en la conferencia. How do I stop the translation? I'm here. Sí, porque estoy hablando y simultáneamente. I can hear it. How do I not stop it? How do I stop it?
Henry, hay traducción.
Hay traducción, pero...
Hay traducción, Henry.
Sí, hay traducción. Ok. Ok, buenos días a todos y todos. Vamos a comenzar nuestra... Ok, all right.
Doctor,
Dígame.
you can just put original audio in the interpretation so you don't hear the translation anymore.
Okay, thank you very much. That's what I was looking. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 presentations today. Just a reminder the housekeeping. The presentations are 15 minutes. I will put in the chat when you get in 5 and when you get in 1. Las presentaciones son 15 minutos y yo les voy a poner en el chat cuando ustedes tengan 5 y cuando ustedes tengan 1 minuto, ¿verdad? ¿Alguna pregunta de alguien? ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿No? Comencemos entonces. Pues Kevin Cruz y Kevin Cruz, David Pineda, and Ana Barahona. Let me start with Kevin Cruz. Kevin Cruz es el profesor de hora en el Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras. Tiene una licenciatura y maestría en Sociología por la Universidad Autónoma de Honduras. Es miembro del Grupo de Trabajo sobre la Niñez, Juventud del Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales. Es coautor de varios artículos académicos y capítulos de libros que exploran la niñez y la juventud en Honduras. Y ha sido disertante en congresos internacionales, nacionales. Recientemente publicó con la Universidad San Carlos en Centroamérica y es coeditor y autor de un libro sobre la migración de la niñez y juventud en el norte de Centroamérica. Ana Saroni Barahona Rivera. Ana es licenciada en Sociología, candidata a la maestría en Fort Flaxo. Ella está estudiando Ciencias Sociales, Estudios Urbanos y Migraciones Internacionales, Fort Flaxo, Honduras. Docente del Departamento de Sociología e investigadora con experiencia en temas sobre migración, género, estudios urbanos y educación. David, rápidamente, pues David, licenciado y máster en Sociología por la UNA, se ha desempeñado como asistente de investigación a organizaciones no gubernamentales en Honduras y actualmente labora como docente en el Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras. Sus líneas de investigaciones son desigualdad social, infancia y juventudes. The floor, okay, Kevin, you can start your presentation.
Gracias, doctor. Solo una consulta. Yo comparto desde la presentación desde mi computadora.
Yeah, You're okay? Yeah.
Ok, perfecto. Listo. ¿Me confirman si se mira, por favor?
Ujú.
Sí.
Y se ve.
Ok, perfecto. Bien, buenos días a todas y todos. Es un gusto estar aquí con mi colega Ana Barahona y mi colega David Pineda. Pues nosotros podríamos decir que hemos venido haciendo un ejercicio reflexivo acerca de entender el fenómeno de la migración en Honduras, no tanto desde las visiones tradicionales que usualmente se atribuyen o se proponen para poder explicar la migración de los jóvenes hondureños hacia los Estados Unidos, que son migración, que son pobreza, que son violencia. Ustedes podrán ver, y seguramente han visto que todos los informes, todos los estudios, cuando hablan sobre la migración en Centroamérica, generalmente apuntan a las mismas causas, ¿no? Apuntan a los mismos fenómenos, que son estos que acabo de mencionar. Sin embargo, nosotros tratamos de hacer un ejercicio enmarcado en una reflexión desde los enfoques de modernidad y colonialidad para entender desde una perspectiva latinoamericana o desde el sur global el fenómeno de la migración. Y para poder hacer esto, pues nosotros proponemos una revisión de la historia de Honduras para poder entender, digamos, en su contexto histórico y en su contexto estructural, cómo llegamos hasta donde nos encontramos hoy en día, ¿no? Con este fenómeno de caravanas masivas saliendo, ¿sí? Desde el 2018, desde nuestro país, y qué podemos decir al respecto, ¿no? Desde una mirada alternativa. Entonces, por eso es que nuestra presentación se llama Apuntes, porque son apuntes, son reflexiones iniciales, por decirlo así, para una nueva mirada a la migración de la juventud en Honduras. Entonces, bueno, desde este enfoque analítico, pues nosotros proponemos, como decía anteriormente, interpretar algunos fenómenos, algunas coyunturas históricas desde estas nuevas perspectivas, y para ello pues consideramos que son tres, digamos, las líneas que en un principio consideramos que han sido clave, ¿no? Para poder llegar a lo que el Estado de Honduras, a lo que la sociedad hondureña es hoy en día, y consideramos, bueno, que son tres dimensiones concretas, ¿no? Una es la dimensión política, la otra es la dimensión cultural y la tercera es la dimensión económica. Entonces, lo que nosotros proponemos en nuestra reflexión es que en cada una de esas tres dimensiones, de esas columnas, digamos, de la sociedad hondureña, pues se han mantenido las relaciones de colonialidad entre nuestro país y los países del norte global, particularmente de los Estados Unidos, y pues justamente por esa dinámica de subordinación, esa dinámica de posición periférica, ¿no? En cada una de esas dimensiones a nivel global, es que pues se han desarrollado ciertas condiciones que han desembocado en una desprotección social para la población hondureña y particularmente para la juventud de hoy en día, un desarraigo identitario y pues una condición de problema general de desempleo y de subempleo, que no solamente es una coyuntura, no, sino que pues responde a un proceso histórico. Y pues consideramos que desde estas tres dimensiones se han desencadenado los procesos migratorios en diferentes, y no solamente de manera reciente, ¿no? Sino que de acuerdo a cómo se han dado esta configuración de relaciones entre Honduras y particularmente los Estados Unidos en diferentes momentos históricos, podemos ver que el fenómeno migratorio también ha cambiado de forma, ¿no? En respuesta a cada uno de esas tres dimensiones que proponemos. Y para ser conciso, pues voy a proceder ya a lo que estamos proponiendo y para poder darle tiempo también a mi compañera Ana. En relación con el mercado laboral y la migración, que es básicamente la dimensión económica de esta reflexión que estamos proponiendo, pues señalamos algo que ya se conoce, ¿no? Que es que la economía hondureña pues se insertó desde un inicio al capitalismo, al sistema internacional capitalista, en una condición de dependencia y de subordinación, ¿no? Y pues básicamente en la dimensión económica esto ha marcado la historia del país, porque esto no fue solamente una coyuntura en un momento histórico, sino que justamente por esta condición en la cual la economía hondureña se ha incorporado al sistema capitalista mundial es que nosotros desde finales del siglo XIX hasta la actualidad se podría decir que hemos atravesado 3 tipos de enclaves, ¿no? Entendiendo los enclaves como simplemente somos una extensión de una economía de los países metrópoli, ¿no? Entonces nosotros, bueno, justamente en el marco de esta reflexión identificamos que en diferentes momentos hemos, digamos, tenido un modelo primario exportador, hemos tenido un modelo de industrialización por sustitución de importaciones y actualmente un modelo neoliberal, sin embargo, no, digamos, en el contexto de una economía hondureña por derecho propio, ¿no? Sino que nuestra economía ha estado subordinada básicamente a satisfacer necesidades de países metrópoli, en este caso los Estados Unidos. Y aquí solamente para ser sintético, para poner los ejemplos, a finales del siglo XIX nosotros iniciamos un enclave minero, ¿no? Que básicamente consistió en la instalación en el país de una empresa de explotación de recursos minerales para poder satisfacer una demanda en los Estados Unidos. Y desde un inicio, una estrategia que nuestro país o nuestros gobernantes han utilizado es, digamos, conceder o concesionar los recursos naturales para que inversores extranjeros, para que países de metrópoli, digamos, exploten esos recursos y, digamos, Honduras solamente recibe como beneficio la generación de empleo, ¿no? Sin embargo, pues esta estrategia se ha mantenido desde finales del siglo XIX con el enclave bananero, luego a inicios del siglo XX con el enclave, primero con el enclave minero, luego con el enclave bananero, y actualmente pues se podría argumentar que pues nuestra economía principalmente se sustenta en un tipo de enclave de maquila, ¿no? En el sentido de que pues los textiles que producimos son para satisfacer nuevamente una necesidad del mercado de un país metrópoli, y pues digamos que en ese sentido la riqueza se traslada directamente hacia estos países, ¿no? Entonces nuestra propuesta en este proceso de reflexión es que justamente en cada uno de estos momentos los ciclos migratorios y los flujos migratorios, tanto de la población hondureña en general como de la juventud, han respondido a estos cambios en la economía del país, ¿no? Por ejemplo, a inicios del siglo XX, que se instala, digamos, en el centro del país, este enclave minero, particularmente en la mina de San Juancito, a través de la compañía La Rosario Mining Company, pues básicamente ocurre una migración interna masiva desde la zona interna del país hacia la capital de la República, ¿no? Y luego con el enclave bananero hacia la zona norte. Digamos que esos van a ser los 2 polos de desarrollo, por decirlo de alguna manera, en los cuales pues se van a asentar esos tipos de enclave. ¿Y qué es lo que va a significar en términos prácticos, en términos de los ciclos migratorios? Va a significar un proceso de migración masiva que respondían a la instalación de estos enclaves, digamos, con capital internacional, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, el primer momento se da a final del siglo XIX, inicios del siglo XX. Luego tenemos un segundo momento a partir del modelo de industrialización por sustitución de importaciones, en el cual, bueno, digamos que se da una nueva etapa en la economía del país porque se crea cierta institucionalidad estatal, se construyen las bases para el surgimiento de una burguesía agraria, y se permite el desarrollo incipiente de una clase media urbana, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué es lo que ocurre durante este periodo? Bueno, justamente por una huelga que ocurrió en 1954, en la cual los empleados de las compañías bananeras exigieron derechos, y eso fue un hito, derechos laborales, y eso fue un hito histórico, porque a partir de aquí pues se dan muchas conquistas a nivel laboral, a nivel civil incluso, como por ejemplo el Código del Trabajo, Instituto Hondureño de Seguridad Social. Eso se da en respuesta a esta lucha obrera, sí, en la década del 50, para que las compañías bananeras pues puedan, digamos, garantizar los derechos laborales de la población, ¿no? Entonces, en respuesta a esto, pues las compañías bananeras, digamos, que eran el principal activo de la economía nacional, pues despiden, ¿no?, una serie de trabajadores que formaron parte de esta huelga, y por lo tanto, digamos que este acontecimiento pues provoca, desencadena un flujo migratorio en este periodo, sobre todo particularmente para buscar, digamos, nuevas formas de ingreso que va a satisfacer un proceso de reforma agraria que se lleva a cabo en la década de los 70. Entonces, digamos que estos ciclos migratorios, más que todo internos, pues responden a estos cambios, ¿no?, que se dan en la economía. Y finalmente,
Kevin,
siempre la dimensión
discúlpame.
económica. Sí,
Kevin,
sí.
discúlpame,
Sí.
tienes 5 minutos.
Ok, gracias. Rápidamente, pues comentar que desde la dimensión económica nuevamente, hoy en día pues estamos hablando de un enclave maquilero y digamos que un fenómeno que refleja esta subordinación de nuestra economía a una economía externa, pues es la propuesta de construir zonas especiales de desarrollo, ¿no?, en la cual pues el Estado hondureño vende su territorio a capital privado para que puedan explotar sus recursos naturales. Y de manera muy rápida, eso es en relación con la dimensión económica, ¿no? Pero en la dimensión política, digamos que de un inicio también el Estado de Honduras ha estado, o el proyecto de construcción de un Estado-nación en Honduras ha estado también, digamos, acechado por potencias extranjeras como llámesele Inglaterra, Alemania y particularmente los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y bueno, en diferentes momentos se han construido, por ejemplo, un Estado oligárquico a inicios del siglo XX, un Estado desarrollista a mediados del siglo pasado y un Estado neoliberal que tenemos hoy en día, donde pues las élites económicas nuevamente garantizan, digamos, cierta defensa del status quo para proteger no solamente sus propios intereses, sino también los intereses geopolíticos, ¿no?, de los Estados Unidos. Y aquí dos ejemplos muy rápidos. Por ejemplo, en la década de los 50, Honduras sirve como plataforma para llevar a cabo el golpe de Estado contra Jacobo Arbenz, y esa fue la primera intervención de los Estados Unidos en América Latina, y Honduras, digamos, pues fue un Estado que sirvió para este proceso, ¿no? En la década de los 80, Honduras también se subordina políticamente al proceso de revolución llevado a cabo por los Estados Unidos, y pues básicamente va a ser la embajada americana, va a ser las Fuerzas Armadas que van a tener el control del país durante la década de los 80, a pesar de haber transitado hacia un proceso legalmente democrático. Y bueno, en respuesta a cada uno de estos momentos, también pues han ocurrido diferentes flujos migratorios. Por ejemplo, en la década de los inicios del siglo XX, pues por una dictadura que fue, digamos, avalada por los Estados Unidos, hubo muchos flujos migratorios por una oposición exiliada, ¿no? A mediados del siglo XX, pues también comienzan a darse, digamos, todo este proceso de migración internacional por parte de las poblaciones garífunas, sobre todo, pues que no encontraban, digamos, cabida en el proyecto de Estado que se estaba construyendo en el país. Y finalmente, en el caso del Estado neoliberal, pues sobre todo a partir del 2009, ¿no? Y creo que este es el ejemplo paradigmático en el cual se ocurre un golpe de Estado en Honduras bajo el conocimiento del gobierno estadounidense, y a partir de entonces se da, digamos, una serie de crisis políticas, económicas y sociales que eventualmente van a desencadenar en migración, la crisis de los migrantes, de los menores migrantes, y finalmente las caravanas del 2018, ¿no? Y pues básicamente que estos son como las dos dimensiones que estamos proponiendo, y perdón a mi compañera Saroni para que pueda desarrollar en estos últimos minutos la tercera dimensión, que es la cultural, ¿no? Adelante.
Ana tiene 1 minuto. Yo sé. Ana, ¿se encuentra aquí? Let me see if Ana is here. No veo a Ana. Kevin, ¿puedes utilizar el minuto que queda? Explicar lo que te queda, lo que te falta.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, básicamente la propuesta con esta dimensión cultural es que, pues desde un inicio, y bueno, eso está fundamentado en una serie de reformas que se llevaron a cabo a inicios del siglo XX y mediados del siglo pasado también, por ejemplo, para construir un Estado-nación, sí, pero básicamente sin incluir, digamos, a todo el espectro, a todos los grupos étnicos, a todos los diversos grupos poblacionales que integran, ¿no?, la nación hondureña. De hecho, el proyecto de nación es básicamente una iniciativa vertical, ¿no? Es decir, proviene desde las élites criollas que quedaron asentadas en el poder después de la Declaración de Independencia, y luego se construyen de manera nuevamente un tanto arbitraria símbolos nacionales, un himno nacional, se trata de construir una identidad, sí, pero esta identidad va a ser, digamos, enmarcada en el modelo del paradigma de orden y progreso, donde una clase, digamos, una civilización que refleje los valores europeos va a ser lo que nos garantice el desarrollo y el avance, digamos, de nuestro Estado, ¿no? Pero ¿qué es lo que pasa en este proceso? Bueno, incluso se aprobaron reformas migratorias para que viniera población europea a nuestro país, porque se consideraba que se quería importar, ¿verdad?, estos valores civilizatorios hacia nuestro contexto. Sin embargo, pues como consecuencia de este proceso tenemos a la gran masa poblacional de Honduras, la mayoría mestiza, descendiente de poblaciones indígenas, diversos grupos étnicos que nunca se integraron, digamos, a este proyecto de Estado-Nación, y que hoy en día justamente son los grupos más vulnerabilizados y son algunos desde donde principalmente tenemos expulsión migratoria, ¿no? Bueno, no sé si mi compañera quería...
Gracias, gracias, Kevin.
Hola.
No encontramos a Ana. Nos vamos a mover a la siguiente presentación. Les pido un favor. Acuérdense que se está traduciendo. Hablen un poquito más despacio porque le afecta a las personas que están traduciendo. Ustedes saben eso. Y al final de todas las presentaciones vamos a hacer las preguntas y respuestas. Ok. La siguiente presentación es la doctora Sara Willamo. La doctora Sara Willamo, docente de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Madre y Maestra, doctora en educación, psicóloga, maestría en educación y especialidad en sociopedagogía y en educación moral y cívica. Amplia experiencia en formación docente y forma parte de varios equipos de investigación. Doctora Willamo, el piso es suyo.
Buenos días. Nosotros vamos a presentar un trabajo que, como ya ustedes saben, forma parte de un estudio más amplio que llevamos un grupo de docentes del área del Caribe y Centroamérica, liderado por la Facultad de Trabajo Social de la Universidad de Radisson. Nos vamos a referir a los movimientos migratorios aquí en República Dominicana y el impacto que tiene en los jóvenes. Nosotros hemos hecho el trabajo desde el punto de vista, desde dos puntos de vista. Por un lado, los inmigrantes que en este momento recibimos en República Dominicana, en mayor medida, que son los de Haití y Venezuela. Pero por otro lado, lo que tiene que ver con los jóvenes dominicanos que emigran, sobre todo a Estados Unidos y Europa. Quisimos ver qué pasa, por qué lo hacen, cómo viven, y en ese sentido fue que hicimos las entrevistas que sirven de base para lo que vamos a exponer hoy. La metodología, como ya ustedes conocen, tiene que ver con el enfoque cualitativo, usando técnicas de análisis de documentos y entrevistas a profundidad. Buscamos diferentes informantes para poder hacer la triangulación entre lo que dicen los jóvenes, lo que dicen madres, sobre todo madres de jóvenes que han emigrado a Estados Unidos y Europa, expertos, catedráticos que son investigadores sobre el tema de migración y sobre todo de la relación dominico-haitiana, que tienen un observatorio permanente porque esto cambia todos los días. Hicimos una selección intencionada de jóvenes de 17 a 24 años. Los datos se recolectaron en el 2018. Hago énfasis en esta fecha porque aquí estos movimientos migratorios cambian todos los días y se añaden factores nuevos en el análisis que podamos hacer sobre esto. Todas las entrevistas se han manejado de manera confidencial, sin identificar informante de ninguno de los grupos. Adelante. Vamos a ver entonces los resultados más importantes de este proceso. República Dominicana cuenta con inmigrantes de distintas provincias. Bueno, cuenta con inmigrantes de distinta procedencia. Para los fines de este estudio, solo nos hemos limitado a los haitianos y venezolanos, que son los que más han venido en estos últimos años. Los haitianos están en primer lugar y últimamente los venezolanos ocupan el segundo lugar en la inmigración. Siguiente. Los jóvenes haitianos llegan al país generalmente junto a sus familias. Algunos llegaron cuando eran niños y han crecido aquí, otros han nacido aquí. Al momento de la entrevista, los jóvenes haitianos se dedicaban en su mayoría a la agricultura y la construcción, mientras que los venezolanos trabajan generalmente en empresas de servicio. Son dos grupos de inmigrantes con características muy diferentes, cada uno, y que tienen que ver más por el nivel académico de los que aquí vienen. Otra de las actividades que realizan los jóvenes de nacionalidad haitiana en República Dominicana, además de la jornada que le corresponden, incluyen actividades recreativas. Algunos dicen que van a grupos deportivos, que practican el béisbol, que es muy frecuente aquí y que le llamamos juego de pelota. Adelante. Los jóvenes haitianos que vinieron a República Dominicana, espérense que yo tengo que cerrar algo aquí para... presentan muchas dificultades con el idioma, la documentación y falta de empleo, es lo que ellos dicen. Justamente en este momento nosotros coordinamos un diplomado sobre derechos humanos donde participan líderes juveniles de Haití y de República Dominicana. Y nosotros como academia hacemos una traducción al francés. Ellos han solicitado creol y últimamente hubo que poner también la traducción a creol, que es una especie de dialecto dentro de su país. En el caso venezolano, el idioma no es un obstáculo y las dificultades que presentan al llegar a la República Dominicana son distintas a los haitianos. Proceso de adaptación a las escuelas dominicanas, miedo a ser deportado y poco apoyo de las instituciones. Con respecto a la regularización o documentación de estos inmigrantes, República Dominicana ha habilitado un programa para documentarlo. Sin embargo, en el caso de los haitianos, pocos asisten al proceso. Primero porque requieren una serie de documentación de su país que allá se les dificulta. Y segundo, porque al documentarse, a regularizarse, tienen que comenzar a pagar impuestos en sus relaciones laborales. Entonces no han mostrado mucho interés en esta parte. Los venezolanos sí hacen un esfuerzo todos los días por regularizar su situación y entrar al mercado laboral de manera regular. Siguiente. El nivel académico alcanzado por los jóvenes de nacionalidad haitiana en República Dominicana hasta el momento de la entrevista, lo máximo era un tercero de la educación secundaria. Estos últimos no mencionaron en la entrevista tener dificultad en la escuela. El tema educación y salud con relación a los inmigrantes haitianos, podemos decir que tenemos un porcentaje altísimo de estudiantes de ese país. Tanto que en este año escolar, por ejemplo, hubo muchos dominicanos que se quedaron fuera de las escuelas y que hubo que buscarle una salida a ese problema, inscribiéndolo en instituciones privadas. Sin embargo, muchas de las escuelas tienen muchos inmigrantes haitianos. Se le ha reconocido como un derecho que se le ofrece en este país, tanto en el ámbito de salud como de educación. Siguiente. Tanto para los jóvenes de nacionalidad haitiana como para los venezolanos, el motivo por el cual vinieron a República Dominicana hasta el momento de la entrevista ha sido la búsqueda de mejores oportunidades. Como todo proceso migratorio, el flujo mayor es de los países más desarrollados a el menos desarrollado. O sea, en una situación de desigualdad, es normal que emigren y que sea en búsqueda de mejor vida. En este caso, por asuntos de necesidades básicas. O sea, estamos hablando de necesidad sencilla de lo primero, derecho a comer. Entonces, esos flujos migratorios se producen por esta situación. Siguiente. Por otro lado, como parte de esta investigación, se realizó entrevista a jóvenes y madres de jóvenes que habían emigrado de República Dominicana a Estados Unidos y Europa, sobre todo de esto. Algunos de estos jóvenes los ubicamos porque en algún momento teníamos oportunidad de acceder a ello porque viajamos hasta allá y aprovechamos para entrevistar a algunos de los nuestros. Y por otro lado, también se entrevistaron padres y madres que tienen sus hijos en Estados Unidos o en Europa. Han emigrado por buscar mejores estudios, o sea, estudios de posgrado generalmente, o porque se emparejaron con personas de esos países. Algunas de estas parejas se hacen a propósito y hasta por negocio, para poder acceder a lograr una residencia, una ciudadanía en esos países que se entienden que tienen mejores oportunidades de desarrollo. Y también han emigrado por asuntos del entorno familiar. Todos estos procesos, tanto lo de inmigración como de emigración, se producen muchas veces teniendo que abandonar a algunos miembros de su familia. Difícilmente estos procesos se dan emigrando toda la familia juntos. Generalmente se va el padre o se va la madre o se van los hijos y se queda papá y mamá. Se desintegra la familia en estos procesos. Siguiente. Dificultades. Los nuestros allá presentan muchos problemas con el frío y el idioma. Henry, a propósito de tu frío y nuestro calor. El proceso de adaptación más difícil es ese, el adaptarse a tener una temperatura tan extrema, a veces de mucho frío, otras veces de mucho calor, y nosotros somos un país cálido los 12 meses del año, entonces eso le ayuda. Y lo otro, el idioma. La separación de la familia y de sus amistades es muy duro. Nosotros tenemos reportes y ahora con la pandemia todo esto se agravó, de gente que han hecho depresión, ataque de ansiedad, porque esas separaciones, esos encierros por mucho tiempo y desvincularse de sus amistades, de su entorno social, genera muchos inconvenientes. Los jóvenes señalaron también que tuvieron que adaptarse al tipo de empleo.
Discúlpeme, Sara, tienes 5 minutos.
Está bien. Obtenían en el país donde emigraron. Los empleos, algunos en los países desarrollados, las cosas difieren mucho de lo nuestro. Yo me río porque nosotros generalmente no acostumbramos a ser tan rígido con los horarios, con rutinas automatizadas, y en los países de ustedes, Estados Unidos, Europa, como que las cosas son muy cuadradas, los recesos, lo que sé yo cuánto. Nosotros salimos a tomarnos un café y ese café puede durar muchísimo y no pasa nada, como que nosotros trabajamos más relajado y al dominicano le cuesta adaptarse a eso. Siguiente. Se le preguntó a las madres de sus hijos e hijas si regresaría en algún momento. Igual se le preguntó a esos jóvenes dominicanos si tenían planeado establecerse nuevamente en República Dominicana. En la mayoría de los casos su respuesta fue negativa. Ya después que se logra una adaptación al sistema, difícilmente regresan. Los jóvenes no tienen en sus planes regresar al país y las razones que dan son las mismas razones por las que se fueron. Hay menos oportunidades de trabajo, no hay seguridad y no hay garantía de sus derechos fundamentales. Conclusión. Con relación a la inmigración, la situación económica, las razones son la situación económica de su país, la búsqueda de mejores oportunidades de estudio, la reunificación familiar y las dificultades para aprender el idioma. Esos son como las grandes conclusiones con relación a la inmigración. Siguiente. Siguiente. Con relación a la inmigración, dificultades para aprender el idioma, falta de empleo y falta de documentación. Siguiente. Bien, este es el panorama que teníamos en ese momento. Actualmente hay mucha variación de esto, sobre todo con el tema haitiano. Hay dos grandes preocupaciones con relación a la ayuda que República Dominicana pudiera brindar a Haití. Y es que es como si se estuvieran compartiendo problemas económicos, políticos, salud, educación, y mucha falta de institucionalidad en ese país. Mucha gente cuando quiere ayudar no encuentra cómo canalizar las ayudas, porque no hay instituciones con las cuales coordinar ese proceso. Entonces, nosotros decimos, nos necesitamos, o sea, somos vecinos, nos necesitamos unos y otros, pero es necesario como organizarse para poder ofrecer esa solidaridad que sabemos que y tenemos muchísimos años intentando hacerlo. Hay leyes, hay reglamentaciones, pero son difíciles de cumplir porque hay desorden en términos de las estructuras estatales de aquí y de allá. Entonces estamos como trancados, que no se sabe cuál va a ser el resultado que finalmente vamos a tener con esto. Muchas gracias y estamos en disposición de responder cualquier pregunta que surja al respecto.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Yo creo que malentendí y una cosa y se me olvidó presentar a Ana Luisa. Y Ana Luisa, asistente de investigación de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Madre y Maestra, especialista de educación Montessori, licenciada en educación, concentración de lengua española y ciencias sociales. Amplia experiencia en educación cívica y ciudadana, coautora del libro Don Fabulose, I'm sorry por la pronunciación, y también participó en esta investigación la licenciada Marlene Pérez Dorpeo. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Anna. I appreciate it. The third presentation is by Doctora Belia Aite Villeda Erazo. La doctora Belia es doctora en seguridad estratégica, maestría en diseño, planificación y manejo ambiental, trabajadora social, socióloga de la Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala, gerente social del INDES, del BID, especialidad en políticas sociales para el área rurales de la FAO, consultora para organismos nacionales e internacionales, docente y asesora de tesis del posgrado y la licenciatura de Trabajo Social e Investigación del Instituto de Investigaciones de la Escuela de Trabajo Social y del proyecto RCYP. Publicaciones de investigaciones y artículos en líneas temáticas de descentralización, derechos de la mujer, niñez y juventud. Su compromiso académico y político se centra en los derechos humanos y políticas públicas desde teorías críticas. Doctora Villeda, el piso es suyo.
Buenos días, es un gusto para mí compartir con ustedes este tema tan importante para hablar de las corrientes migratorias, que es un tema sumamente vigente en el marco de las problemáticas mundiales y nos estamos refiriendo a problemáticas que atraviesan las fronteras, ¿verdad? Entonces, para referirnos a ese flujo, a esos problemas en el flujo migratorio y en el tema que voy a presentar en esta mañana, que es emigración y deportación, la doble expulsión y abandono de las adolescencias y juventudes migrantes. Voy a subir mi presentación. Vamos a ver. Perdón, sí. No sé, aquí. No está mi presentación. ¿No se ve? No. Perdón. ¿Qué pasa? Perdón, solo estoy tratando de subir mi presentación, pero me parece que no la tengo acá. Vamos a ver.
Doctora, do you want to come at the end after Godfrey, Professor San Bernard presentation? So you have time to find your presentation? Is that okay? Oh. All right. Belia?
¿Qué manda? Perdón.
Belia, si quiere, podemos pasar a la presentación del profesor San Bernard y usted arregla eso y la presenta después.
Me parece, está bien, sí. Yo envié mi presentación a Sara, no sé si ella también la puede compartir. La envié en Drive.
A los colegas de marketing. Is anyone?
¿Sara?
Sofía.
Para yo, ¿no?
No, Sara King.
Sara King. All right.
Bueno.
No le encuentro. Ok, vamos a pasar a la cuarta presentación, ¿verdad? Ya ver los colegas de marketing can help you. Ok. All right. Let me introduce Dr. Godfrey San Bernard. What can we say about Dr. San Bernard? Everybody knows him. Very popular person. Acting Director, the Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, Salesian University, West Indies, San Agustin, Trinidad and Tobago. His current academic interests include problems akin to the population and development applied statistical analysis, research methodology, evaluation research, and social policies. His current research interests focus on children and youth, population policy, and dynamics in the Circum-Caribbean, violence prevention and safety promotion, vulnerability and resilience in small states, return migration, and the measurement of social phenomena, having been primarily responsible for the establishment of the Master of Science in Development Statistics that is offered in the Salice. Dr. San Bernard continued to serve as a coordinator of that program. Dr. San Bernard, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the audience, the virtual audience. I'm pleased to make this presentation on the push-pull factors and young Trinidadian migrant impulses, reflections of fortunes in Canada and the homeland. Well, first of all, when we think in terms of Caribbean immigration in Canada, I think, when we look at the early, prior to the 1980s and even earlier, Caribbean migration to Canada was not a big thing. In fact, in the early years, in the pre-independence era and in the early independence era, a lot of the migration that took place from Trinidad to other places globally really was directed toward Europe and England in particular throughout the 1950s, the post-war years, and into the early 1960s. And when we look at, Caribbean immigrants in Canada, between 1956 and 1981, we were talking roughly just over 200,000. And this was largely due to a number of, restrictions that existed in Canada up until around 1962, when such restrictions were lifted, and of course, Caribbean persons were able to enter Canada more freely, as it were. As a matter of fact, in 1962, you had the Commonwealth Immigration Act in Britain, and that too sort of placed a damper on Caribbean immigrants entering Britain, and Canada and the United States became new routes, particularly from the 1960s onward. And when we think in terms of Caribbean people migrating to Canada and other places, the vast majority came from Jamaica, Guyana, Haiti, and Trinidad and Tobago. And when we think in terms of the Haitians, of course, many of them went to Quebec in a sense. So there have been a couple landmark Canadian immigration legislative arrangements in 1962 and 1967 that were really favorable to Caribbean migrants, including Trinidadians and Tobagonians coming and entering Canada as immigrants. So just to give you a sense of, different national populations and how they fared in terms of entry into Canada in different periods, you can see it was not until perhaps the 1970s that you started seeing Caribbean populations being featured among the leading source countries producing immigrants into Canada. And this continued through up until the end of the 1980s. By the 1990s, of course, you saw that was not the case anymore, because other populations were taking advantage of the spirit of multiculturalism that is an ideology that pervades Canadian society and really, permits, different cultural groups predicated upon national boundaries and so on to celebrate their cultures and to provide that friendly environment, that friendly international environment in a Canadian context. So the main aim of this paper really is to understand the migratory experiences of young natives of Trinidad and Tobago upon migrating to Canada, and of course, the push-pull factors that appear likely to shape their lifelong decisions to reside permanently in Canada or to return to their homeland. And 4 research questions were actually sought in terms of providing answers. The first one, of course, what are the general impressions of young natives of Trinidad and Tobago who have lived in Canada, having migrated from Trinidad and Tobago? What push-pull factors influence those who decided to live permanently in Trinidad after having migrated to Canada and been there on a relatively or quasi-permanent basis? What push-pull factors impacted those who have harbored thoughts of returning or have actually returned to Trinidad despite opportunities to exercise the choice of residing permanently in Canada? And how do young Trinidad and Tobago natives value their decision in relation to their prospective fortunes in life? In terms of the literature that exists, there have been a lot of literature focusing on, discrimination in a Canadian context as it's meted out to other immigrant populations, as it's meted out to Caribbean populations, and the work of Ramcharan way back in 1976, Passaris in 1983, come to mind. There have also been studies looking at Montreatians, stereotyping of Montreatian domestics by Turretin in 1976, and of course, Haitian immigrants in Quebec. So there have been, studies looking at the kind of experiences that Caribbean people have had to put up with in a Canadian context as far back as the 1970s, and more or less documenting the experiences of Caribbean immigrants in Canada. Of course, this study is based on a number of theories. Of course, the push-pull theory, based on the work of 19th century geographer Ravenstein, and looking at, what are those factors that push and pull migrant populations to the extent that they engage in a sort of social cost-benefit analysis. And in terms of the push-pull factors that we have identified based on the work we have done, several themes have come to the fore: environmental, economic, political, institutional, and demographic. These are purely descriptive, and of course, there may be some interconnections, while it is difficult in a sense to establish such interconnections. Of course, we draw neoclassical theories of international migration, which really emphasize, the importance of higher wages and the differences in terms of the demand for labor in different settings, particularly in some of the metropolitan areas of the globe and so on, and what impact it has in terms of the social cost benefit analysis that our immigrant populations in Caribbean societies engage in order to make their move. Of course, this is also predicated upon the fact that, when we think in terms of migration, it's largely precipitated by economic factors. I mean, human beings have to satisfy their material well-being. And if it is that you have to leave your country of origin to go elsewhere to satisfy your material well-being, so be it. Of course, there are benefits to the home country through remittances and capital flows. And that in and of itself could be used in a positive way to impact development, whether in community settings, whether in personal private settings in households, or even at the national level. Of course, dependency theory features insofar as the global power imbalance in terms of economic and political power that exists between the core and peripheral nations of the world, and and what impact that has in terms of stimulating migratory moves and so on. And then, of course, there's a dual markets theory, which is predicated upon, the fact that, migration is largely, in many ways, it's selective. It's selective of people with higher levels of education but as people with higher levels of education migrate and fill specific jobs and occupations to advance development, so too would you attract low-skilled labor and so on. So in terms of the research design, methodology, and respondents, the study draws on a phenomenological approach. It's virtual in-depth interviews with 16 young people in their 20s and 30s, roughly equal numbers of males and females. Many had family members, relatives who lived in Canada dating back to the 1960s. Many had a history of visits to Canada, either during their childhood or as young adults. Some of the respondents were born in Canada of Trinidadian parents and lived all their lives in Canada, with occasional visits to Trinidad and Tobago. Those young people who were born in Trinidad and Tobago exhibited middle-class backgrounds in the main and went to the best primary and secondary schools in Trinidad and Tobago. Canada was a principal option for school and work above any other place of destination, and some of our respondents also exhibited a history of international travel. So already what we saw based on our attempts, we tried far and wide to get as much as possible a good mix of respondents, but all who came to us exhibited these kinds of attributes, and in many ways it seemed to suggest that it's really a middle-class group of immigrants from Trinidad and Tobago who constituted the immigrants in Canada. So what are the push-pull factors? As I mentioned before, environmental, economic, political, institutional, demographic. In terms of the environmental factors, the push factors in Canada, from a Canadian context, obviously would have been the challenging weather for most of the year, except during the summer. A pull factor, however, would be, of course, a greater demonstration of concern over matters that relate to the preservation of the natural environment, recycling, and community aesthetics. A lot of those locals who went to Canada really hailed, those virtues. A big push was, the loss of domestic social networks in the homeland, though online technology can assist in maintaining the contacts. And I think being in Canada, there was a loss of that, but the immigrants also hailed, the technological advance for providing a cushion, so to speak. A pull was the increased prospects for building new social networks through associations with diaspora organizations. So diaspora organizations did have a big impact in terms of, the pull and the lure to perhaps, try Canada and stay in Canada. And of course, another one, greater personal safety and reduced fear of victimization as a result of criminal activity. Those were the environmental factors. When we come to the...
Goffrey, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. When we come to the economic factors, of course, greater options for specialization in the pursuit of economic activities that are commensurate with the education and skills capacity of young Trinidad and Tobago natives. Of course, another one was the proliferation of potentially rewarding opportunities in a society that makes provision for immigrant labor and characterized by incessant population growth. And this would have come out, of course, in a number of the legislative arrangements and so on that I alluded to earlier in the presentation. Of course, high wages and salaries, in spite of subtle differences dependent upon citizenship and training profile, and greater ease of starting business ventures. That was one of the things that was very attractive, the ease of starting business ventures as young persons. The business environment is much more conducive to the accumulation of wealth for young persons, and greater prospects of acquiring durables such as a home ownership, motor vehicles, investing in the stock market, and so on. Political factors, push factor from Trinidad and Tobago was obviously the politics of race in a small society such as Trinidad and Tobago, its implications for nepotism in the job market, capitalizing on business ventures, and also even in the context of pursuing higher education and educational opportunities. However, pulled in Trinidad and Tobago, that came out from some of the respondents, opportunistically, they saw social networks involving an association with political elites in Trinidad and Tobago as possibly, a pull factor. Institutional factors, the health insurance coverage in Canada was a big pull, right? Another big pull was, greater insulation from a culture of crime and violence that that is a serious social problem in Trinidad and Tobago. Law enforcement, they saw it as being purposeful and contributing to the prevention of crime and other acts of deviance in a Canadian context. And certainly another pull was, greater options at the tertiary level in terms of skills building, in terms of social networking, among other things. And last of all, in terms of the social and demographic factors, a big pull was the familial nuclei that existed as a result of, the history of settlement in Canada that really took off back in the 1960s and 70s. And the fact that many of the immigrants perhaps did not have many relatives, if any, left in Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, emigrating to Canada, many of them would have entered into consensual unions with partners who have no interest whatsoever in coming to live or work in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, Canada's migration policy, generally speaking, has been somewhat attractive in many ways. So in terms of concluding and some thoughts for the future, well, Trinidad and Tobago, like many other Caribbean countries, will continue to face a declining working age population, and that will not change. It will continue unless there is population policy imperatives that would change that. And this siphoning of our young people to other places such as Canada, we have to check that, especially when we take into account, the investment we made in these persons. Of course, we have to take stock of the negative push factors that stimulate migratory decisions of young persons who leave Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, many countries in the region have already begun embarking upon managed migration policies and so on to boost their labor force due to declining domestic populations of working age. That's something we may have to consider here if this siphoning of our peoples continue. More and more, there's a trend of young persons leaving Trinidad and Tobago to go to places such as Canada. The evidence from Canada is indicative that, of the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is really losing valuable human capital, having invested in such capital. What we can also say is that emigration is no longer a safety valve. There was a time in the history of Caribbean societies where we referred to emigration as a safety valve. We have to assure our nationals of a worthy life in Trinidad and Tobago, and may even have to begin considering a population policy that embarks upon managed migration as a component of such a population policy. Of course, countries such as Barbados in the Caribbean region, the Turks and Caicos Islands, they have already gone in that direction. The Cayman Islands, they do it, but the latter two, of course, for different reasons. One has to remember that emigration is positively selective, and that we will continue to lose our best minds and best skills if current trends consistent with the emigration of young people to Canada and elsewhere continues. And all this means is that if it continues that way, we are simply reinforcing the legacy of dependency theory by not getting our act together and putting our house in order. And I say no more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey. Dr. Villeda, were you able to solve your technical component? doctor Villegas pudo arreglar sus aspectos técnicos. Oh, there you go. All right.
¿Sí? ¿Está viendo la presentación?
Sí, sí, sí. Pero necesita que la ponga en presentación con diapositiva. Aquí. Ya, ahí. Go.
Bueno,
Miren,
como
Belia,
ya
Belia,
realicé la presentación inicial,
Belia, discúlpeme. ¿Podría poner la slide entre presentación con diapositivas?
perdón,
Arriba, arriba. Vaya para arriba, arriba, arriba. El curso. Y luego en la parte que dice presentación con diapositivas, solo presione eso, por favor. Arriba, arriba, arriba. Lo encontró. Usted ve Acrobat, vista, revisar, presentación con diapositiva. Presione eso, por favor. Ahí, para arriba, para arriba, para arriba, para arriba.
No sé.
Ok, no hay problema. Creo que la podemos ver. Está bien, Belia. No hay problema. Doctora Belia Villeda, está bien. Creo que la podemos ver. Ok. Siga, doctor. Ok, there you go.
Ahora sí.
Ya, ahora sí. Gracias.
Bueno, la presentación refiere el tema de migración y deportación, las caras de la doble expulsión y abandono de las juventudes en Guatemala, y es básicamente referirnos a esas dinámicas de migración de las adolescencias y las juventudes en el marco de esta pandemia del COVID-19, compartir con ustedes que nosotros tenemos otras líneas temáticas que ya hemos avanzado en el tema de migración, y esta está justo en la coyuntura de la dinámica del COVID-19, y tal como se ha expuesto en este espacio, la migración es un fenómeno que se configura en el escenario de las problemáticas políticas, económicas y sociales de carácter nacional e internacional. Y por esta razón se considera importante analizar, como se está haciendo en este espacio, esos factores que contribuyen a que los jóvenes salgan de nuestros países, esos factores que atraen y que atraen a las juventudes, y que seguramente también son esos mismos factores de expulsión, como la falta de oportunidades laborales, los problemas educativos en el marco de este modelo de desarrollo que representa la realización personal de los jóvenes de ser y de tener, como la trascendencia que tiene el modelo neoliberal. En el umbral de proyecto migratorio y tener que sortear adversidades, ellos viven esta doble expulsión obligatoria cuando se sale del país, porque el país los está expulsando por falta de oportunidades de acceso a la educación y a la salud, y viven la doble expulsión también en el momento de ser deportados. En ese marco quiero referirme al tema de cómo se configura la migración, que constituye verdaderamente un fenómeno. Perdón, ¿me escuchan? Sí.
Sí, sí se le escucha.
Ok.
Ah,
La migración constituye un fenómeno latente en la configuración de este escenario de políticas sociales y económicas, de manera que, tal como estoy explicando, en el proyecto migratorio se sortean diferentes adversidades, y para ello yo voy a referirme a las diferentes fases que ha tenido la migración en Guatemala, especialmente a partir de 1977 y al 86, que refiere el conflicto armado de 36 años, que marcó de una manera sustantiva la tendencia de migrar como proceso de resistencia. Y recordemos que la migración sigue siendo un proceso de resistencia y de protesta en las condiciones en las que nos encontramos en nuestros países. En el marco de esas estrategias de sobrevivencia, especialmente se refuerza el flujo migratorio por las condiciones de violencia política que vivía Guatemala, especialmente en estas épocas. Y durante esa época, en la primera fase fue cuando se implementaron las políticas de tierra arrasada en poblaciones indígenas principalmente, y en regiones específicas, de manera que estas poblaciones tuvieron que buscar refugio en México, y en este contexto también se vio afectada la economía de Guatemala, y lógicamente esos indicadores de empleo y subempleo aumentaron tanto por las mismas razones políticas, económicas, como también por las condiciones de empuje que forzaron la migración, y el promedio de inmigrantes ilegales en indocumentados, mejor dicho, en este contexto fue aproximadamente entre 13,000 y 15,000 personas. El contexto también de Estados Unidos en esa primera fase requería la mano de obra para actividades domésticas y de restaurantes. La segunda fase la ubicamos con el incremento de inmigrantes legales indocumentados a partir de 1986, o sea, cuando finaliza la primera fase. Y acá vemos que hay un promedio de más de 22,000 inmigrantes por año, y las condiciones políticas de Guatemala se suponía que se estaban transformando porque se buscaban acuerdos entre la guerrilla y el ejército, y se propiciaba un espacio para gobiernos democráticos. A pesar de estar en este proceso, muchas comunidades igualmente fueron arrasadas, y las personas no estaban en condiciones de regresar a sus comunidades, y este proceso dio espacio para que los migrantes lograran también un estatus de legalidad en Estados Unidos. Para la fase 3, que comprende del año 1989 a 1991, entonces nosotros encontramos en esta fase se fortaleció ya en Estados Unidos el enfoque restrictivo en las fronteras por medio de campañas como las que suceden ahora de intercepción y de deportación desde México, y sumado a ello las condiciones de la ruta migratoria empezaron a ser mucho más difíciles. Se fueron volviendo mucho más complejas, con presencia de autoridades migratorias y la presencia de pandillas y del crimen organizado. Y en este contexto fue que se creó el estatus de protección temporal para algunos países de Centroamérica. Ahora bien, cuando la fase 4 la ubicamos de 1992 al 2003, y aquí han ingresado un promedio de 25,000 inmigrantes, estamos hablando solo de guatemaltecos indocumentados, y en esta fase ya se habían firmado los acuerdos de paz, pero también en el contexto que se firmaron los acuerdos de paz, se implementaron los planes de ajuste estructural y el debilitamiento de las funciones del Estado, lo que ha reflejado mayores condiciones de desigualdad que aún se mantienen. Ahora bien, como para ir concluyendo este tema de las fases y quedarnos en las fases que actualmente tenemos, ubicamos la fase 5 de 2004-2011, que se caracteriza por un aumento también de la migración irregular de un 127% respecto a la fase anterior. Y en esta fase sabemos que se han reforzado las barreras físicas, el aumento del número de agentes, el aumento de aprehensiones y con eso mismo el aumento de deportaciones, y de esta forma se ha consolidado un enfoque de seguridad que ha reducido el enfoque de derechos. ¿Por qué hablamos? Porque en este contexto fue el derribamiento de las Torres Gemelas y el enfoque de seguridad ha cambiado, ¿verdad? ¿Cuál fue la metodología para llevar a cabo este estudio? Pues es una metodología de una epistemología interpretativista con un diseño etnográfico y fenomenológico para establecer las prácticas institucionales y conocer el fenómeno de la migración en el contexto transnacional que caracteriza las migraciones del norte de Centroamérica y así comprender el accionar de migrantes y observar su relación con otros actores de la sociedad. Las preguntas generadoras fueron cuáles son las realidades que enfrentan las y los adolescentes en la experiencia migratoria y cuáles son las prácticas y coordinación institucional en esta gobernanza migratoria, especialmente Guatemala, Estados Unidos, y comprender las experiencias de migración y deportación de adolescentes guatemaltecos, asimismo explorar estas prácticas institucionales que apoyan o dificultan ese proceso. Se ha hecho una revisión preliminar de 34 entrevistas dirigidas a adolescentes y jóvenes cuyas edades oscilan entre 14 y 24 años, de las cuales se puede caracterizar 27 hombres y 7 mujeres que han sido básicamente los resultados que ahora te van a compartir. Acá para compartir con ustedes, Guatemala es un país multiétnico, es multicultural, plurilingüe y básicamente sigue siendo un país rural y con un bono demográfico de jóvenes verdaderamente significativo. Tenemos 4 pueblos que son los pueblos mayas, ladinos o mestizos y garífunas y xincas. Los pueblos mayas constituyen el grupo mayoritario, y el sur y oriente del país está poblado principalmente por mestizos. Y el occidente y el norte, que son los departamentos que están en la frontera con México, son los que tienen mayor población indígena y donde se ubica también en la parte del Caribe la población garífuna. A partir de esta investigación que relaciona la migración y la deportación, se considera que los problemas estructurales son los que determinan este proceso de inmigración. Y acá tengo una cita. La pequeña no pudo ir a la escuela y por lo tanto le resultó imposible aprender a leer y a escribir. Desafortunadamente, nos dice la misma persona, ella padecía una triple exclusión común en Guatemala, incluso en la actualidad: ser indígena, ser pobre y ser mujer, situación que es compartida por cientos de miles de niñas mayas en Guatemala. Y entre las causas principalmente resaltan las causas económicas y las mejores condiciones de vida, que si bien es cierto, algunos jóvenes mencionan directamente que si hay carencias económicas, los 3 trabajamos, mi mamá, mi hermana y yo, pero no alcanzaba el dinero para pagar la renta, la luz y todo. Siempre habría problema con eso. Y eso refieren los entrevistados, que la idea es encontrarse con mejores oportunidades y una mejor calidad de vida, porque refieren que uno siempre busca algo mejor. Y el hecho que me haya presentado una oportunidad de emigrar acá, pues la verdad es que no lo piensan ni 2 veces. ¿Qué refleja eso? Que las condiciones económicas y mejorar la calidad de vida se presenta como una razón, no solo que refleja desde una visión de limitación económica, sino que permite el acceso a servicios y a a ese nexo que encontramos entre la migración y el desarrollo. También está ubicado el acceso a la educación como una causa que se destaca en la expulsión de migrantes y que en este país, especialmente en el contexto de la pandemia, hemos visto una alta deserción en el sistema educativo, especialmente en el sistema educativo primario y secundario en el país. Y nos refiere un joven. Yo estudié en la Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala, que es la universidad pública, 6 semestres, pero la Universidad de San Carlos en el departamento de San Marcos, que es frontera con México, no tiene tantas oportunidades del pensum porque los pensum son cerrados y el joven entrevistado considera que sigue siendo un pensum atrasado para las problemáticas actuales. En algunos casos, la condición de estudio se suma a esa vulnerabilidad económica de los jóvenes en los territorios, en su mayoría la economía familiar campesina, que no permite que las personas tengan acceso a educación y muchas ocasiones los jóvenes también se ven obligados a generar ingresos en el hogar, lo que remite de nuevo a una migración forzada, producto de las condiciones de vulnerabilidad económica que viven las familias en Guatemala. También otro tema...
doctora Villa tiene 5 minutos.
Ok, la violencia también es otro tema complicado en este país que expulsa a los jóvenes a migrar y dice, ella se puso a llorar y dice, mi historia es muy triste. Yo perdí a mi mamá hace unos meses y mi prima me llevó a trabajar a la capital. Tengo 2 hermanos a quienes tenía que, 2 hermanos en Georgia, Estados Unidos. Ellos me mandaron dinero, pero ellos me dijeron que tenía que trabajar. Entonces llegué a la ciudad capital, me fui con una prima, empecé a trabajar limpiando una casa y en la noche cuando fui a acostar, el patrón, el esposo de la señora, se metió a mi cuarto y me violó. Después me di cuenta que estaba embarazada y me botaron a la calle. Entonces, en este momento voy para Estados Unidos para que nosotros imaginemos las dificultades. Y las experiencias en la ruta migratoria para ir avanzando se enfrentan a una serie de dificultades para entender el contexto que lo lleva a migrar. Los factores de riesgo migratorio se perciben como un primer factor. La presencia de la institucionalidad de las migraciones, como seguramente les puede suceder a los venezolanos, a los haitianos, a los hondureños que pasan por Guatemala, que el primer factor sigue siendo la institucionalidad de la migración. Me llevé un pequeño susto nada más en México, donde sí, digamos que nos persiguió la migración, pero bueno, ya estando fuera de la vista de ellos, nos tuvimos que esconder. Eso nos dice un joven que entrevistamos. De manera que implica la deportación, el retorno forzado a sus territorios de donde salieron expulsados. La reunificación familiar también es un lugar de expulsión de migrantes, pero también de atracción para ellos. Es el deseo de conocer, que si bien es bastante el argumento sumado a este deseo en las condiciones de superación personal, también de conocer el país, y porque el mundo dice este joven, pero se habla mucho de las condiciones, especialmente a donde ellos están migrando, en su gran mayoría, que es a Estados Unidos. Entonces yo viendo una oportunidad de cómo hacerlo, porque si otras personas pueden, y yo también aquí puedo llegar a hacer este proceso. En cuanto a la reunificación familiar, se presentan casos distintos que están documentados en la investigación. El primero refiere al apoyo brindado específicamente a un familiar para poder retornar, ayudar a mi hermana que estaba detenida, que estaba sin papeles y que la tenían en México. Mi sueño siempre ha sido estar con mi mamá. Desde que yo tenía 16 años, ella me dejó desde los 3 años. Entonces siempre me quise venir con mi mamá. Las condiciones de violencia que ya las compartí. Entre los desafíos está responder a estas realidades, porque la migración es un fenómeno de múltiples dimensiones y debe entenderse y asumirse desde la perspectiva de derechos humanos. porque la migración es un proceso de expulsión de territorios por pobreza, desigualdad, proyectos extractivos y extensivos que siguen siendo en nuestros países las mayores trampas de la pobreza. Incorporar el enfoque crítico de derechos humanos por la estrecha conexión que tienen con la democracia y el desarrollo para políticas migratorias y comprender los impactos de la estructura de poder en el país, entender que la migración desafía a hombres y a mujeres de maneras diferentes. Implementar políticas públicas y planes para entender las necesidades básicas de la población en los territorios, no permitir criminalización y victimización que se hace a los migrantes, sino dignificarlos, porque pese a los riesgos deciden viajar buscando mejores condiciones de vida para ellos y su familia. Resignificar la presencia de instituciones de migración que actualmente implica para ellos la deportación y el retorno forzado a los territorios de donde salieron expulsados. Expulsión que se ve reflejada muchas veces en los procesos de deportación acelerados que estamos viendo en los últimos años, donde no se da espacio para poder presentar una condición de refugiado, que también la condición de refugiado se vuelve sumamente compleja por los tiempos que tienen que esperar en condiciones complejas en el país, en este caso a los guatemaltecos en México. Establecer coordinación entre países para favorecer la asistencia, la atención y la migración y protección para prevenir el tráfico ilícito de migrantes. Esta es la presentación en este momento desde mi condición como investigadora en este proyecto y en la Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala. Así que muchísimas gracias por el tiempo y pido disculpas por las dificultades en esta presentación.
Muchas gracias, doctora Villeda. No hay problema. Pasa todo el tiempo, ¿verdad? Ok, tenemos ahorita, muchas gracias a todos los participantes, los presentadores. Y ahorita tenemos exactamente 13 minutos para ver si hay preguntas o comentarios. Preguntas o comentarios. Anybody? Do you have any question or comments about any of the presentations? No, I don't see anybody. Okay. Maybe, okay, what do you think? Maybe within the next 12 minutes, maybe we can discuss things that you couldn't discuss in the presentation because of time. Maybe you want to continue that discussion? No? Early meeting. Anybody, once again? In summary, parece que hay ciertas comodalidades en los distintos países que acaban de presentar aquí, ¿verdad? La inmigración como proceso, que tiene ciertas comodalidades de los países del sur global, o como Kevin y Ana mencionaron, como la modernidad, la decolonialidad como proceso para entender la inmigración presenta otro tipo de interpretación que ha sido muy útil, ¿verdad? Cuando se quiere moverse de los procesos europeizantes. Other things that I saw was the lack of immigration institutionalization in some of there is a very limited process in order to engage with immigration. If we're talking about Guatemala, if we're talking about Honduras, Dominican Republic, process that has changed dramatically in Mexico. La literatura habla de la inmigración vertical como parte de la industria de inmigración, ¿verdad? Cuando ellos hablan de la de la inmigración vertical se refieren particularmente a todos las desventajas, a todos los challenges, a todos los obstáculos que le presentan a los futuros inmigrantes cuando atraviesan de los Estados Unidos. Aunque no se mencionó aquí, otro aspecto es el desarrollo de la industria de inmigración, tanto legal como ilegal, ¿me entiende? Y el ejemplo más grande de ese proceso es el uso de so-called coyotes, ¿verdad? O personas que ayudan a los posibles inmigrantes a moverse hacia el norte, que generalmente cuesta mucho dinero. Ok, ¿alguien más quiere comentar? Wow. You can do it in the chat too.
A mí me de manera, bueno,
Dígame.
de manera particular, aunque no escuché por algunos momentos la presentación del colega de Trinidad y Tobago, me llamó sumamente la atención la importancia también que tiene el que los jóvenes o las personas que en este momento están emigrando se queden en nuestros países. Porque acá había una discusión en ese tema también. Si los países que en este momento son los receptores de migrantes no estuvieran poniendo obstáculos a la migración, seguramente nuestros países estuvieran vaciándose cada vez más y nos quedaríamos primero sin población joven, que tendrían que ser como nuestros mayores capitales, ese bono demográfico. Pero me llama la atención ese proceso de envejecimiento que habla el colega de Trinidad y Tobago, que son situaciones que no tenemos en Centroamérica, creo que ni Honduras, que estamos acá, ni Guatemala. Entonces yo creo que hay una diferencia sustantiva por lo menos en Trinidad y Tobago y Centroamérica, no obstante que Centroamérica y el Caribe sigue siendo como de los mayores flujos migrantes que hay en el mundo, ¿no? Entonces sí me gustaría que el colega de Trinidad y Tobago compartiera estas reflexiones, que nos ampliara en esta reflexión tan interesante y que marca una diferencia con nosotros en Centroamérica.
Godfrey. Godfrey, are you there? Professor San Bernard? Hello. I don't see him.
Okay,
yes.
Sure. Yes, thank you for the comments. And I think, yes, there is a bit of a difference between the Central American countries and many of the countries in the Caribbean. And I think it starts with fertility rates in the countries, because many of the Central American countries still have fertility rates that are above the TFR of 2.1. And once your fertility rate is above 2.1, you will continue to have that intrinsic growth momentum in your population. So you will continue to have relatively high numbers of births that will operate like a snake spray through the body of the human population and will continue to sustain the size of the potential size of your labor force and those who are of working age and so on for a long time. Additionally, the countries of the Caribbean seem to have, based on the evidence, mortality experiences that are a bit more favorable when one looks at life expectancy at birth. And in cases where you have more favorable life expectancy, that too contributes to aging. So it's not only that the population in Caribbean societies are declining due to reduced fertility, right? they are also going to be impacted by the fact that people are living longer. And the more older people you have in your population, the greater the absolute number of deaths you will have. And that too will contribute to further decline in the population. And if you are losing people due to migration, and especially your best minds, you are in for some serious trouble. And I think, you know, there are some countries in the region who have already taken stock of that. I know the Barbadian Prime Minister, she has been very vocal. And I know she has been talking about, you know, a managed migration policy in Barbados, because Barbados is one of those Caribbean countries that is ahead of the pack in the Caribbean in terms of that declining fertility and the aging of the population due to favorable mortality experiences and so on. So they have gone ahead. And once we continue to lose our young minds, we are going to be in serious trouble. And that's why I spoke about the push factors as well, in terms of the push factors from Trinidad and Tobago, because our situation with respect to violent crime and safety, and even in the context of, you know, relationships that may have bearing on class and ethnicity and so on, you know, it could be better. And I think all of those are factors that, you know, when people begin to weigh the pros and the cons, and in some instances, even institutional decay that has been rearing its ugly head. You know, the next
Professor Bernard, I'm sorry, and now we have a few minutes or so.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So I'll wrap up. So that's it, basically.
Looking forward for the article. Dr. Willamo, you have 3 minutes to comment.
Mucho menos. No, yo creo que a modo de conclusión y de coincidencia en este panel, quiero decir que hay un elemento común, y es que la gente se va de su país en busca de mejor vida, en busca de resolver necesidades básicas, de tener acceso a derechos fundamentales, como es alimentación, salud, educación. O sea, no nos vamos de nuestros países por simple gusto. Y es un ejemplo que me ponía un amigo recientemente. Por ejemplo, los movimientos entre Canadá y Estados Unidos son mínimos y son muy diferentes, porque estamos hablando de dos países en igualdad de condiciones prácticamente. Entonces, el tema de la migración tiene que ver con desigualdades muy fuertes que tenemos marcadas. El otro elemento que yo lo escuché en Canadá, en uno de estos encuentros que hemos tenido, y que me parece que sintetiza lo que estamos diciendo, es que los países en mejores condiciones son generalmente solidarios y entienden que tienen que serlo. Sin embargo, la solidaridad tiene que organizarse, porque si no, puede terminar en un caos que no hay ningún tipo de control. O sea, los países organizados son solidarios, pero elaboran un protocolo para recibir a esos inmigrantes y poderle dar las condiciones mínimas que como seres humanos se merecen y necesitan. Entonces, no importa en qué condiciones, si somos receptores o si se van los nuestros, eso hay que organizarlo, y son los estados que le corresponde organizar y hacer cumplir esos protocolos y esos procedimientos. Entonces, yo pienso que ahí hay algo importantísimo, y es una tarea de muchos de nosotros. Organizar la casa para recibir, porque si yo no tengo ni siquiera en la mía, es muy difícil entonces, y aparte de eso, en estado de caos, es muy complicado el problema. Pienso que esos son como elementos comunes a muchos de nosotros en el Caribe y Centroamérica.
Gracias, doctora Willamo. Y hemos llegado al final de nuestra sesión. Muchas gracias a todos y a todos ustedes. Y seguimos con la conferencia. Muchas gracias y tengan un muy buen día. Hasta luego.
Gracias a ustedes y tengo deseo de verlos.
Okay. Nos vamos a ver. Bye.
Bye bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Nice conference, nice group.
Hi, good day all. My name is Tarian Young, and I will be chairing the second session on the third day of this conference. The overarching topic for today is the exposure to violence among child and youth populations in Central America and Caribbean societies. We have many presentations today, with one of our group presentation not being able to facilitate today, and that would be Mr. Felix Cruz, Ms. Anna Barahona, and David Pineda. However, we still have 3 other presenters ready to present. So before we begin, I want to first lay down some ground rules. Each presenter or panelist have 15 minutes. However, don't worry about the time. I will be keeping it and make note of it in the chat box. So please, occasionally as you're presenting, just glance in the chat box. I will let you know when you have 5 minutes, 1 minute, and when your time is up. The other thing is we are having a Q&A segment. So all persons, you are encouraged to ask your questions in the chat box and for our panelists to answer afterwards. However, please make note of which panelists you are asking the question to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Marjorie Jameson Charles. But before Dr. Charles begins her presentation, I'd like to share some background information on her. Dr. Charles has been an educator for the past 42 years, with a career spanning from primary to tertiary level education. She's provided service in a number of roles, such as teaching, psychological support, guidance counselor, as well as student advocacy. So from St. Lucia to New Zealand, and now to Trinidad and Tobago as a lecturer at UWI, her positive influence on all age group knows no bound. Given Dr. Jameson Charles' extensive career, her research interests vary. However, the centralized focus are on education, professional, youth, and organizational developments, as well as empowerment. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jameson Charles, who will be presenting on violence in the lives of secondary school students in Trinidad.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Let me just share my. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your warm welcome. Today, I'm going to look at violence in the lives of secondary schools in Trinidad and Tobago. As the chair said, I have, because of my area of expertise as a guidance counselor and as a student advocate and so on, I have seen a number of students who have had a number of issues from with violence or who have experienced violence in their lives. So I want to first start by introducing our team. Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Dr. Lee Pigot, Ms. Shankar, and Ms. King. Okay, I want to thank the team for the research that we have been doing. All right, so one of the things I want to start with that introduction, where we talk about violence experience within and outside of school may threaten the well-being of students. And I have seen that in many occasions. For example, just recently, there was a teacher who had killed his wife in front of his children and then killed himself. And this would cause some kind of trauma for the children. Or I think last week or the week before, another set of children witnessed their father being shot at a parking lot for some for some issue in parking. And this have unintended consequences for the well-being of our children. And what we see now, we also see things like bullying, cyberbullying, and all of these issues that young people experience. So what this does is impact on their well-being. And also we look at from a research standpoint, we see a number of research that speak to what happens to children who are experiencing violence, some kind of violence in their life. So I know we have already spoken about the project in the first day of the conference, but I just still want to remind us that what the project is all about and how we came about doing this project in Trinidad and Tobago. So this is the RCYP project, and I want to thank I want to thank Dr. St. Bernard for having his confidence in me to be part of that project. And these are some of the areas that were explored in the project, but my focus is education. So as an educator, I focus on how the children experience violence in the school. So today we just experience violence and how it affects them. So today, the purpose of this presentation today is to report some empirical findings on what we have done so far. And we use we look at the multiple dimensions of violence, and then as we said earlier on, it came from a broader multiple perspective mixed method studies, but today I am going to present the quantitative finding. So our theoretical framework, we use the ecological systems framework, okay, to look at the violence experienced by the children. But this framework was most appropriate because it looks at how the different systems affect the individual. And it comes from Uwe Bronfenbrenner, who speaks to the inherent qualities of the child and his environment and how it influences how the child will grow and how the child will develop. And this has been used widely in social sciences because to look at child maltreatment and how we could use the systems approach to assist children who have been having issues. Okay, so it looks at the continuous interaction of the environment as it affects the child. So we also looked, also when we were looking at our research, we looked at the child abuse prevention, the WHO consultation on child abuse prevention, and we also looked at the conventions of the rights of the child. Because when we're looking at these things, when we're looking at the children and the maltreatment of children and also violence experienced by children, we also have to think about these consultations and these conventions and to see when we're speaking about the rights of the child, we're looking at what are some of the things that they speak to in terms of what violence is. So we have some definitions here. Okay, so we look at child abuse or maltreatment, and we look at all forms of physical violence, injury, abuse, and so on as definitions. So when we, from our standpoint and from an educational standpoint, we see children who experience violence from different parts of the community or different parts of society. That is why the ecological systems theory is so relevant to this paper. So we look at home and family, we look at school violence, we have violence in institutions, and I think Mr. Ramey spoke about institutions yesterday. Community violence, and also the mass media violence, which is a very insidious. If those of us who do work on the social media violence, okay. So one of the things that we are looking at, and the questions that we were asking in that paper, in that presentation, is what was the most common dimension of violence experienced by students? We also wanted to find out whether the attributes of sex, age, ethnicity, and home situations were associated with the likelihood that they would experience different dimensions of violence. And we also wanted to know the relationship among the different dimensions of violence. So what did we do? Okay, we had a survey design. We used the juvenile violence questionnaire. Okay, and we surveyed, we had a sample of 407 students across Trinidad. There were 14 secondary schools. And first of all, we would have liked to have more students, but we all know what happened in 2019, 2020, 2021, the pandemic. So we were not able to collect all the data that we would have liked to. We wanted to collect data in Tobago and all of these other places, and it was difficult because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to present what we have. So the research, we use a random selection approach, and then we had to make sure we had to get approval from the ethics committee at the Ministry of Education, the UWI Ethics Committee. We had to get all this approvals before we even started collecting the data. Okay, so we contacted the schools via phone, email, and so on. It was a very, very tight schedule, but we were able to get 400 and something students to complete our questionnaire. All right. So the instrument we use is a standardized instrument, has been used already. The juvenile violence questionnaire, it is part of a national survey on school exposure to children's exposure to violence. Okay, so we were able to use that because of the reliability of it and the validity of it. And the questionnaire explores 5 dimensions. We look at conventional crimes, child maltreatment, parent sibling victimization, sexual victimization, and witnessing, and indirect victimization. So these 5 dimensions were operationalized, and we were able to identify and to the different dimensions in our questionnaire, and we were able to do some very, very interesting data analysis. So some of the findings, if you look at the graph here, conventional crime and witnessing of and indirect victimizations were, a lot of students experience conventional crime and indirect victimization. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with my, and also pair and sibling victimization. These 3 were more prevalent among the students, but conventional was highest. And if you look at child maltreatment and sexual victimization, it was not as prevalent as the others. So we wanted to find out about whether the attributes of sex, ethnicity, and home situations were associated with the likelihood that they would experience the different dimensions of violence. So we use binary logistic regression to do that. And we make sure that all of the assumptions were tested and they were not violated. So these are some of the results that we got. In terms of conventional crime, if you look at sex of the students, the males and the females, 200 males said yes and 4 said no. If you look at family structure, both parents, mother only, and so on and so forth. This is what you would have seen in terms of the findings. So when we look at the regression, there was only a significant relationship or significant difference among sex. Okay, so males, and the males it was significant for males. Males had a higher incidence of conventional crime from the data gathered. The next one we look at is child maltreatment. And if you look at the table, you will see where females had higher than the males in that one. And also, if you look at ethnicity, and you look at family structure, and you also look at age, but if you look from a sex and the family structure and ethnicity, we had some high numbers of students saying yes. So when we also look at it from child maltreatment, it was only significant if among from a gender standpoint or from a sex standpoint, where girls, it was higher in girls than in boys. If you look at the sibling victimization here, all right, the males, the females, and you look at it from a family structure, both parents, if you see 2 or 5 as compared to mother only and or father only. All right, so when we look at the regression, we see that it is significant among age and the family structure. If we go back, we will see, from an age standpoint, age 14, students age 14 show the higher incidence of victimization, of parent sibling victimization. And when you look at sexual victimization, there's a lot. Remember, the data showed that they were not. It was very, very low. It was the lowest in the results, and this is what we have. If when you did it, we look at it from a sex and ethnicity standpoint. These were the significant differences. So females and ethnicity, which one is the highest? If you look at it from a yes standpoint. Other. Okay. So, in witnessing direct and indirect victimization, this is what the findings show, and from the variables, it's also sex, where it is females also witness indirect victimization. So what does that say to us in terms of what students witness from a societal, from an ecological system standpoint, and so on? So we could talk to that later. And if we look at the relationship among the different dimensions of crime, if we realize witnessing and indirect victimization was significant among all of the different, all the other dimensions, with pair and sibling victimization having the highest the highest positive correlation, and then child maltreatment. So what we are saying, but if you look at it also, you would see from a conventional crime standpoint, pair and sibling victimization and sexual victimization were not significant. There was no significant relationship among these variables. So what are we saying there is that from that standpoint is that the relationship among some of the variables.
Excuse
the
Dr.
students
Krause.
who, yep.
Your time is up.
Already?
Please wrap
Okay,
up,
sorry.
please.
Let me just wrap up, sorry. So what we're looking at from that standpoint is that the young people are exposed to various forms of violence, and the likelihood that males are associated with experiences of conventional crimes. We're looking at females in terms of child maltreatment, and we're looking at witnessing indirect victimization and sexual victimization, and students who are identified as others were also associated with sexual victimization. So the way forward, I'm just going to wrap up the way forward. We need to look at the systems. We have to have the systems approach to that. And we also have to look at how we're going to help our students from using a life skills approach too. Having them what we are going to do with them, how are we going to help them deal with this if the violence that they are confronted with. And then we want to consider the health promoting school initiative to support students. And then there we will look at we will be able to work towards SDG 16, where we promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, and we provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jameson Charles, for your very insightful, comprehensive, and thought-provoking presentation. Now we move along to our second presentation, which would be provided by Dr. Renelle Lee-Piggott. Dr. Renelle Lee-Piggott is a program coordinator for the Postgraduate Diploma in Education and is a lecturer in Educational Administration at the School of Education of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She was a primary school middle management leader and teacher. Now she's a higher education quality assurance external evaluator and examiner, featured speaker, consultant, and an associate editor for the New Equity in Education and Society Journal. Dr. Lee-Piggott also have many research interests that focus on principal leadership, social justice leadership, education privatization, school culture, school and system improvement, and school-facing challenging circumstances. To understand her research interests better, I'd like to introduce her, who will be discussing secondary schools' effort to mediate violence experienced by students.
Thank you very much, Ms. Young. I will just share my screen now. Okay. Good day to everyone, wherever you are, whether it's in the morning or in the afternoon. pleasant day to you. So I'm continuing, I guess, with the RCYP project we're presenting here today, and focusing on secondary schools' efforts to mediate violence experienced by students. So this presentation will begin with somewhat of a background. I'll touch on the research questions, a bit about the theoretical lens that guided this particular paper, and go into the research design and present the findings and implications following that. So, I mean, this, I think, is nothing new to anyone in terms of violence being a global concern. And it's everywhere. There is wars and rumors of wars, and we just only need to look just as close as the war between Ukraine and Russia. So wars, rumors of wars, yeah? Then we have escalation of violent protests everywhere you turn. You just need to turn on your television to Al Jazeera News, and we get the whole rundown of the various violent protests over increasing costs, many of them as a result of the pandemic, you know, all the effects, economic and social effects of the pandemic, and of course, corruption in governments and so on. So a lot of violence taking place. Then of course, gun-related violence, which unfortunately is nothing new to many nation states, and we're seeing it. I mean, we can speak of the US with the number of mass shootings, and it's becoming a yearly occurrence, it appears. Just recently in Thailand, we heard of that that father that went into that school and harmed those students that were sleeping in and quite young children too, infant children. You know, so the violence is everywhere, the shootings in schools as well. There is some understanding in some circles that across Latin America and the Caribbean, per capita, violence is most prevalent compared to the other international countries. So there has been many violence reduction programs coming out as a result of our global situation. So persons are seeking to find ways, try different programs in order to reduce that violence. And one notable one is from UNICEF, who has produced a toolkit of different activities and programs to help with just that. We also have many studies, empirical studies on aspects of school violence from persons, for instance, like Morgan Windle, Williams, 2013 hearing in Trinidad and Tobago, Crawford and Burns, and the list goes on. So we can recognize that there is, of course, an increasing number of students that are experiencing violence in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere. If we are to think of schools as a microcosm of society, what plays off in this society is likely to trickle down into our schools, and so it has with respect to violence, unfortunately. And this violence has been experienced indirectly, directly, as we've heard from previous presenters. So indirect, through witnessing and so on, as direct being a victim of that violence. But here in Trinidad and Tobago, there seems to be a scarcity of evidence on secondary schools' violence reduction attempts in Trinidad and Tobago, yeah? And so this is one of the gaps we're hoping to fill with a paper such as this, yeah? So just as a bit of a recourse in terms of touching on the background literature that we focused on, types and sources of violence and their effects. By way of types, of course, they're the direct ones, the verbal, physical, emotional, and psychological. And of course, we can throw in cyber bullying and so on in there as well. Sources of violence. Sources of violence might be in the home, may come from communities where families live in communities that might be considered high crime communities. Violence may emerge from within school itself, particularly as the literature will bear out, schools that are situated in communities that may have a drug den close by, for instance, would tend to experience violence emerging within their walls. And of course, the wider society and individual coming as a source of violence. Sometimes, parents may not be able to explain why a child may be violent, right? And so we think about individuals as a source of violence. But I've separated out the last column here, structural violence. While it is a type, it is quite different from the direct forms of violence. So structural violence has to do with systems and structures and policies and relationships that may exist within our school and education systems that speak to inherent forms of violence. Through these means, there is often no identifiable actor, but in the way we do things, the rules that we may have in place, the policies that we may have in place, students may be indirectly or indirectly become victims of violence. Yeah. Now, the effects of violence, internalizing and externalizing violence. So coming from these types, coming from these sources, of course, the manifestations of these violence acts and how they affect persons. And we talk about internalizing in terms of withdrawal, depression, self-harm, and externalizing problems such as persons then having experienced violence, they in turn become perpetrators of said violence. Okay, now in trying to understand reducing how schools, secondary schools reduce school violence, we have used somewhat of a theoretical lens that speaks to critical peace education. And critical peace education stems from an explicit understanding of peace education as a criticism of society. Central concepts of critical peace education are structural violence, organized peacelessness, and participation, giving an impression of the interdependence of international and internal social structures of power and dependence in and outside of school. Yeah. So what we find is there are generally two types of peace that persons may use or approaches to reducing school violence, and that is negative peace, positive peace. Negative peace speaks to addressing direct violence. So those types that I outlined earlier. It's similar to what we would call a ceasefire. So, you know, you would ask the students within your schools to not bring weapons. You do search and seizures at the gate. You would try to get peace in that way. And so what that actually results in is a false sense of peace. So while I may not bring a weapon, a student may not bring a weapon, it doesn't necessarily mean that the violence has discontinued. So in fact, a short-term calm is experienced. This negative peace approach is much of a quick fix. But different from that is a positive peace approach, which is more of a promotion of social justice principles of respect and tolerance and so on. And so this type of work it focuses on the cultures of school, focuses on the individual's responses and relationship with others. So it's committed, it's messy work, it requires dedicated programs, right? Meeting with students and their families and so on. But this type of approach is more lasting because it focuses on positive and healthy school cultures and, you know, developing and creating that happy school. So the way to go really is to address both the direct and the structural violence that may exist within the school walls. And so we use this as sort of lens to analyze the data moving forward. So in order to get an understanding of how schools mediate the violence that is within their walls, we ask two questions. How do secondary schools facilitate students' well-being? What education and school structures, practices, and relationships are employed to enhance the lives of youth by reducing violence? Sorry. And this is how we collected our data. So we used focus groups, and of course, this is within the education theme, just as the previous paper, within the education theme. And we use focus group interviews, quite similar to talking circles, with 7 groups consisting of 68 participants. Those participants included school personnel such as principals, teachers, and parents. And we utilize a thematic approach to analyze the qualitative data that we collected. So findings. Our findings, it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of understanding the efforts of secondary schools in treating with violence. What we recognize is we've heard narratives, some positive, some negative. So quite a few of them negative, narratives of deficiency, narratives of despair, narratives of discontinuity, and I will wrap up with narratives of success, you know, so end with the good news. Okay, in terms of narratives of deficiency, however, so this quote here is really, and what I'll present is exemplar quotes for each of these particular themes. So on improving the well-being of students, I read just a bit of it, the students suffer from abuse of varying nature. So we recognize the direct and multiple forms of violence. We now we have emotional as well as physical abuse, and many of them I've seen I've seen it. Their parents would come in school because a lot of time they will be acting up and stuff, and the parents would curse them, call them names like dog, worthless. And I have also seen a parent run his son down and beat him with a cutlass. So you're seeing the internalizing and externalizing problems coming forth, the types of violence. And I'll continue. We've seen children act the way they do because of what they are experiencing at home. So that's the main challenge we face dealing with children who are experiencing these forms of abuse, having to settle them and educate them. And secondly, I would say that the ministry could provide more support, because we have one guidance officer and she's overwhelmed because she's rotating between, I think she said, 7 to 10 schools, which I think is crazy. So this teacher is really identifying teachers' lack of strategies and training in trying to improve the well-being of their students. She recognized the need for support, as well as we can see that there's no school-wide program. There's no collective responsibility in working towards improving the well-being of students in schools where violence is prevalent. Narratives of despair. And from this parent, and you can see as you read through the quote, so we get a sense here of an example of structural violence. Everybody is backstabbing, but nobody is doing anything. But you're seeing the PTA trying to do something. That's a Parent Teachers Association. That backstabbing means the educational system in this school is nobody wants to accept responsibility for their actions and for moving forward. And they keep forgetting the purpose is the kids, and these are the future of Trinidad and Tobago. It hurts me to think what is going to happen to Trinidad and Tobago and the way even politics is going, what is left for these kids, selling marijuana, shooting somebody. So we can sense the narrative of despair coming through there. Then we go into narratives of discontinuity. So this speaks to stories of while they may have experienced some successes, even with their non-whole school approaches. Yes, I'm aware that I'm out of time, thanks. So I'll just wrap up if you don't mind. Thank you. So we can see that with these narratives of discontinuity, while they may have some successes with some of the approaches that they've tried, they end up being discontinued after some time, whether it is they run out of funds or persons who were in charge of running the projects eventually move on and so on. And so narratives of discontinuity in treating with reducing violence at the schools. But I'll close up with the narratives of success, where, again, even though the approaches are not whole school approaches, what they have recognized in some of these schools is that an attention to individual students internalizing and or externalizing problems is one of the ways that they can get success. Not through like whole school assemblies only or whole class sessions, but really getting intimately close with the students and working through their particular issues. So some of the implications of our findings speak to a need for dedicated school-wide programs. And if we think back to the positive peace approach, that speaks to a school-wide effort involving the village, involving collective responsibility and partnering with the community, partnering with parents, not leaving them out in treating with the violence that may be faced in schools. Because as we know, in some schools, this is really very high and really detrimental to many students. So, and I'm also, an implication as well is the need to pay attention to not only direct violence, such as verbal and so on, but also violence inherent in school structures and systems that help to perpetuate the violence that occurs in schools. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee Pigot, for the work that you and your team facilitated, especially to present for this conference. So now I'm moving on to our fourth presentation, because our third group of presenters are not here with us. And our fourth presenter, or third, would be none other than Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, who will be presenting on differences, inequalities, inequities in the experience of child homicide in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. St. Bernard is no stranger to this conference, especially since he is the acting director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social Economic Studies, SALISIS, at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. He has many academic and research interests, and just to name a few, we have population policy and dynamics in the Circum-Caribbean, applied statistical analysis, children and the youth, violence prevention, and safety promotion, among others. Dr. St. Bernard also has many other responsibilities that range from being a coordinator of the MSc in Development Statistic Program, lead researcher for the Hemispheric Project, Rights of Children and Youth Partnership, RCYP, in Latin America and the Caribbean. He has also authored several scholastic work that has been published. So the floor is now yours, Dr. St. Bernard.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, it gives me great pleasure to deliver this paper entitled Differences and Inequities in the Experience of Child Homicide in Trinidad and Tobago. For the purposes of this study, a child is defined as a person under 18 years. And child homicide is really the act of killing a person who is under the age of 18 years by another person, right? These data can actually be captured in police databases, and therefore, insofar as they reach such databases, they reach there because they are actually considered as criminal homicide. Much of the criminal homicide cases enter the public domain. Much of it that enters the public domain relates specifically to adults aged 18 years and over. So it is not surprising that, child and adolescent cases, notwithstanding the fact that they do exist, they are often lost in the flurry of discussions about, those cases that occur among adults. And except for dramatic cases, as recently there was, this case of an infant who was killed by a mother, right? And except for such cases, this scourge, right, as it relates to, child homicide, it is yet to seriously impact discourses on crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. So the rationale for this study is one where, first of all, children have rights to life and living to attain adult status eventually. National policies and development agendas have to promote and progressively impact such rights. It is a public health phenomenon, and that is largely interwoven in national cultures of violence that are becoming increasingly prevalent in Latin American and Caribbean societies. In Trinidad and Tobago, infant and child mortality rates, along with adolescent mortality rates, are unfavorable. And this is so when we compare such rates with others on a global standard. They have to be improved. And more favorable mortality profiles are desirable goals in terms of what is happening not only among children and infants, but also across the sexes as well and across other age groups. But this particular paper is focusing on what is happening among children, and as I said before, children under 18, right? So as we move on, we can think in terms of, a definite need in Trinidad and Tobago, and from a demographic standpoint, our infant mortality rates and our child mortality rates are still relatively high by progressive country standards. And by reducing child homicide, we can help to treat with reducing this rate, right? This has been a scourge that has continued and been affecting the country for the first 2 decades of the new millennium. It continues to affect the country during this period. The rates are high, they are unfavorable, and they really do not measure up to what we aspire to by virtue of what is expected of a developing country with progressive ideals. Child mortality is a phenomenon that has to be eradicated in every society, and every society that takes pride in labeling itself as a civilized society. Unfortunately, as I've been saying, child mortality, child homicide continues to be a real phenomenon in Trinidad and Tobago, and every case has to be considered as one too much. So when you look at these figures here, you may not be able to see them properly. We have some Caribbean countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. These are some of the countries that have some of the highest child mortality rates in the Caribbean. And then when we look at Central American countries, we see some of the Central American countries, they even have higher mortality rate, homicide rates than the Caribbean countries. We look at South American countries, and they are similar in many respects to the Caribbean countries and the Central American countries in terms of homicide rates. But then there are several countries such as Singapore, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Austria, Luxembourg, New Zealand, where you find that they have less homicide rates of less than 1 per 100,000. So where you have these high homicide rates, it's quite likely that you're going to also have high child homicide rates, and there is a correlation somewhat between the two. So as we move on, you can see again, the variable rates across some countries in the region as far as child homicide rates are concerned. And you can see the countries that stand out, and Trinidad and Tobago is among them. And all of this, drove us to sort of attempt this research. And the research aim is really to, first of all, focus on whether there are age-determined similarities or differences existing with respect to different dynamics as they relate to child homicide. And we are looking at specific age-determined groups. We are looking at the under 5 population, which include infants and preschoolers. We are looking at the pre-adolescent child population, those aged 5 to 9, and then we are looking at the adolescent population, 10 to 17. The methodology is based on data collection, largely secondary data that were obtained from CAPA, the Crime and Problem Analysis branch of the Police Service of Trinidad and Tobago. And we were able to analyze these data from the beginning of the new millennium in 2000 up until 2019. So we are really looking at the first 20 years of the new millennium. And child homicide rates, whenever we make reference to child homicide rates, we are comparing them, the number of child homicides to the media population estimate and extrapolations of them in some instances. We draw on some international data. And in terms of the cases that we study, we look at differences and inequities in child homicide experiences in relation to attributes such as victim sex, victim's ethnic background, victim's age, offense characteristics such as the means employed, the probable cause, section status, and in some instances, geography such as the location of the event. So when we look at some of the statistics now, we can see that, the vast majority of cases were to those children 10 to 17 years. Of course, it's overwhelmingly boy children that are victims. 79.5% of the child homicides were male as opposed to 20.5% female. And then overwhelmingly children of African origin, 71.1%. So this is already indicating some measure of inequity when we look at the ethnic origin of the children who find themselves as victims over the 20-year period. Children who have been victims of homicides, overwhelmingly children of African descent, whereas you would expect children of African descent to be more or less similar in number to those of East Indian descent, and perhaps a little more than those of mixed origin and other racial groups. That 71.1% is indicative of gross inequity in terms of the racial balance there, right? Of course, there's some inequity with respect to the gender balance, more or less indicating that males are the ones that stand out, and there's a heavy concentration among males. Of course, what you see as well is that fathers have primarily been the perpetrators among cases where the case has been detected. And in many instances, a lot of these cases really go undetected. You can see here just about 10% of all cases have been detected, right, where the perpetrator is actually known, so to speak. I think this is a function of the cases that have been detected. And you can see that once you happen to be a child under 5, and to a lesser extent, a child between 5 and 9 years old, you have higher rates that, the perpetrator is going to be known, relatively speaking, when compared to what happens among adolescents. So oftentimes we have a better sense of knowing who the perpetrator is, although, it is still relatively low because we are talking about rates of knowledge of less than 40% in all instances. When you look across the period in terms of what is happening, we see the highest concentration of these events took place between like 2008, 2009, thereabouts. Those were the periods when you had highest concentrations of child homicide cases across the 20-year period. There have been declines since, but the pattern is somewhat unpredictable, somewhat erratic, and it's sort of indicative of, the random nature of such events on an annual basis, so to speak. If we are to analyze this thing, generally speaking, the analysis actually, when we look at it in accordance to the law of large numbers, one can say that over the period, one can say a pretty robust trend has emerged. And in terms of, the general indication of, the child homicide as a percentage of all homicide, we are talking about approximately 6 child homicide cases per 100. This is where it actually is settling when we look at the long run over the years in terms of settling at a rate, so to speak, per 6 child cases per 100. Interestingly, child population sizes are expected to decline in the future based on population projections for Trinidad and Tobago, and you could actually see the relative size of child populations as we go through time to 2050. back in 1965, child populations constituted about 50% of the national population. By 2050, it will be about 1/5 of the national population. And given the trend of experiences, that our children are having, if we do not do anything about it, I mean, it's going to be very alarming that notwithstanding this declining relative size of child populations, that there's going to continue to be, that high prevalence of child homicide. I just want to bring out a few more things. Again, you can see some inequities in terms of Port of Spain. Port of Spain stands out in no uncertain terms, and within Port of Spain, it is expected, as far as child homicide is concerned, the Besor Street area and the Belmont police station area, those are the jurisdictions where you have, inordinately high occurrences that speak to some measure of inequity in terms of spatial occurrence. And North Trinidad, generally speaking, when compared to the rest of Trinidad, it stands out again in terms of the inequities as far as child homicide is concerned. When we look at distribution now, when we look at, age, when we look at sex and ethnicity, again, you see, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about all children under 18 years or we are looking at those who are preschoolers and infants, those who are in the pre-adolescent stage or those in the adolescent stage, African males stand out consistently across the age groups. Although when we look at, those who are in the pre-adolescent stage and the adolescent stage, we see a pretty much similar pattern when we look at, African females, East Indian males, East Indian females, and mixed males. But generally, the males are the ones that are standing out in terms of, the child homicide. Now, as we go on and as we approach the end of it, by way of, regardless of age group, if you look at this table here, regardless of age group, boys feature more frequently than girls among child homicide cases, and increasingly so in older age groups. For homicide cases with child victims, charges are much more likely to be laid in instances involving younger victims under 5 and 5 to 9 years old. And I mean, you can see that when we look at the detection status, and it's pretty much consistent with an observation I made earlier on when I was talking about whether or not, one knows who the perpetrator is in the case of these child homicide cases. So these are some interesting observations. As we go on, when we look now at, the means employed, though quite variable in all of the predefined child age group, the means employed in killing children in younger age groups, and I'm talking about under 5 and 5 to 9 years old, it seems more variable. It seems more variable, right? With beatings, fire-related events, chop wounds, and poisonings standing out regardless of age. And you can see it here, right? It is much more variable because if you look at the distributions, they seem to tend to be fairly evenly distributed across the different categories. But as you go to the oldest age group, the adolescents, it is less variable because the vast majority of them are dying as a result of the gunshot wounds. So when we look at death to gunshot wounds, it is evident that, regardless of age group, right? Those in the adolescent stages of life, those are the ones who experience the gunshot wounds much more so than others. The data indicate that stabbings feature more frequently as children transit from young childhood into adolescent life. And then we come now to speak a bit about plausible causes. And in terms of plausible causes, prospective cause is most variable, plausible cause is most variable in the deaths to that occur among the adolescents. And again, you can see it here, right? It's most variable here, right? It's most variable here. And this is much more so when compared to the under 5s and the 5 to 9s. Again, although
Dr.
this is
Simbanad,
not
are you hearing me?
as, although it does not appear to be as evenly distributed as one would like, it is more evenly distributed than these two here. And that implies that it is much more variable, and understandably so, right?
Hi,
Domestic
Dr.
violence
Simbanad.
and domestic disputes feature as principal triggers in cases involving child homicide for under 5-year-olds and 5 to 9-year-olds. Revenge feature in the cases of child killings for all 3 age groups, but is likely to be more associated with turbulence in family settings for children under 5 and 5 to 9-year-olds. Again, you can see it manifesting itself here, right? The data also point to gang-related activities as featuring principally among child victims aged 5 to 9 years old and 10 to 17 years old. You can see it here in terms of what is actually happening, albeit with different manifestations.
Dr.
Dr.
Simbanad,
I would like to say that, lower socioeconomic status groups, associated fertility trends within such groups, and their contribution to observed declines in live births. Again, there's a demographic phenomenon taking place here. And what this is basically saying is, although we may see, generally speaking, declining fertility overall, in the lower socioeconomic status group, fertility is still relatively high. And you're going to have larger numbers of children in those groups. And those groups may find that eventually, if we don't put things in place, the trend is going to continue and escalate in those groups, right? We need to address the culture of violence in urban working class communities dominated by persons of African descent. Particular focus should be on the factors that predispose preteen and teenage boys to gang-related activities and raise their prospects of becoming targets and prospective fatalities. There's very little or no research targeting the family as an institution in contemporary Trinidad and Tobago. There's need to understand familial dynamics and especially the deleterious impact of violence in such settings. These are borne out based on evidence highlighting poisonings, revenge, and the prospects of arson as a means employed in the death of child homicide victims. Overall, efforts to control violence and violent death nationwide could also favorably impact the phenomenon of child homicide, especially through reducing access to guns and instituting harsher penalties for such offenses. So I rest my case and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Simbanad, for your very comprehensive presentation. We have a few minutes left, so I will take the time to ask a few of the questions that I noticed in the chat box. Just find them. The first one came from Natasha Joseph to Dr. Lee Pigot, where she asks, can a practitioner employ the 2 types of critical peace types on a phase basis to control violence?
I would say yes. Treating with violence is a difficult problem, a truly difficult problem. You're talking about dealing with with learned behaviors. We're dealing with matters of the heart. We're dealing, with when you talk about anger and different emotional responses. These things are matters of the heart, things that, and the mind, the soul. And so the approaches that we would need to be comprehensive. And so choosing to use both positive peace approaches as well as negative peace approaches, I would endorse that. Because certainly you want persons to put down the gun, quote unquote, as well as treating with those cultural elements within schools and so on, and of course involving as many persons as possible that can assist.
All right, thank you very much. I definitely hope that answers your question, Natasha. The second question came from Alicia Shepard, and she wants to know, are there any thoughts on balancing teacher training, whether it be for dealing with violence or otherwise, and absenteeism, so that teachers can remain in the classroom on a more consistent basis? So, Dr. Jameson Charles, can I have your input on this question?
Let me see if I could answer this question. Let me hear it again.
Are there any thoughts on balancing teacher training, whether it be for dealing with violence or otherwise, and absenteeism, so that teachers can remain in the classroom on a more consistent basis?
Okay, I'm hearing, so you're talking about teacher absenteeism, because she's asking about whether teachers would stay in the class on a more consistent basis. Now, there is a balance between teacher training and we have at the School of Education, the teacher training aspect deals with a number of things where the teachers are exposed to life skills education and so on and so forth to be able to assist the student. But from an absenteeism standpoint, there are a number of reasons why teachers are not in school. So sometimes we have to look at it not just from a teacher training standpoint, but then there are other what you call confounding variables in society that may cause or that may influence what you call absenteeism. For example, it may not be a teacher training issue, but it may be a personal issue, a personality, some other issue that the teacher may have. That is why the teacher is not coming into the school. So we have this absenteeism. So many times we try to equate teacher training and teacher absenteeism, but there's a fine line between that training and absenteeism, because many times we are trained, and that doesn't mean we train because we want education, but we want a certification. So sometimes I am trained because I maybe want to get a promotion in the school. That doesn't mean I am dedicated to the training to become a better person, but mainly because I may want to become a head of department and so on and so forth. So what we have to look at when you look at teacher training is why do you want to be a teacher? What are some of the issues, or what are some of what contribution you want to give to the children or to education in your country? And it is a matter of the heart, like Dr. Lee Piggott spoke about a while ago. There is a head and there is a heart. So we're talking about the head, but in terms of the heart, where are we as teachers? And what contribution that we want to make to society? And this would impact more on the absenteeism than the training. That is my perspective.
Thank you very much. So now I want to move on to a question for Dr. Lee Piggott. The person asks, how willing have you found parents to partner with and follow through to the end with service providers to address youth violence?
Right, how willing have I found it? Now, I wouldn't be able to speak to that with respect to data coming out from the RCYP project, because we didn't directly ask that as a question, yeah? Or it didn't come out into the data, but coming from experience, over my years of being within education as a teacher myself, and then, as a lecturer now, what we've seen is that parents who may have gotten bitten by the bug, they've recognized the urgency in dealing and treating with school violence and violence among youth, they would be first to run towards forming these partnerships, even going out into the community themselves and encouraging, initiating these partnerships so they can treat with violence within their schools. However, you would always find, as with any, I guess, with any initiative, there are some who would jump onto the bandwagon quite early, but then as time goes along, as matters get deeper, you get into more activities and so treating with those pressing and difficult issues that need to be dealt with when you're talking about violence, some will fall off the bandwagon. Some would not stay as long. Some parents would not stay as long towards seeing the success, the realization of success when it comes to reducing violence within schools, right? And of course, as we know, there are some parents whom we may wish and love and really want to be on board, and we never see those. We all know, persons in education all know this, yeah?
Thank you very much. We have 4 minutes, so that might be room for one more question for you, Dr. St. Bernard. How has the child homicide data been observed relative to perpetrator group? So that would be like the peers, the parents, etc.
Okay, thank you. I attempted to deal with that when I was talking about the perpetrator, and I made the point about, the fathers seem to be the ones who are the main perpetrators of child homicide. There is some reference to acquaintance. There is some reference to stepfathers, stepmothers, mothers, and so on. And there is in the data some reference to persons who are outside of the familial household, so to speak. But as I mentioned, it's difficult to get at it exactly, because if you looked at what I was saying, less than 40% of the cases that we know about, less than, in terms of the overall number of child homicides, we only know the perpetrators for about 40% of those cases in the case of infants, and even less as we go to older age groups. Overall, it's just about 10%. So it has, as long as you cannot detect these cases, it will be very difficult to answer that question and engage in the classification as one would like to.
So briefly, we have 2 more minutes. So Dr. St. Bernard, one question. What target programs can be implemented for male youth in regard to homicide prevention or intervention?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, this paper spoke to child homicide victims. And I think if it is that you are talking about programs to be implemented, the programs would have to be implemented based on knowing who are likely to be the perpetrators. And I made the point earlier that, there is a strong association between child homicide and the rate of homicide, generally speaking, in your society. Clearly, you have child homicide because you're in a violent society. And whatever programs and interventions are necessary to deal with aggression. Up to this morning in the news, I saw 2 men were killed because of a cow, right? Come on, I mean, we have to really take aggression seriously and get to the bottom of the sources of it. And I think there are those out there who already have an idea as to what it could be. And unless we deal with issues of aggression, which escalate into violence of variable magnitudes, I don't think, we will be able to solve the problem. So that's about the best answer I can give at this point.
All right, thank you. Quickly, Dr. Jameson Charles, to end.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I just saw Alicia's response in the chat. She was referring to those times where teachers are absent because of training. What I have noticed on the Ministry of Education standpoint is that they try not to do any training during school time. during school hours to prevent teachers from not being in class. Many times, if they have training for teachers during the school, not during the vacation, but during school time, there are always provisions in place to ensure that the children are safe and to ensure that there is somebody, a substitute teacher or someone in the school to be there with the students to ensure that that there's no major disruption in the school system. So from the training standpoint and the teacher training standpoint, the Ministry of Education tries best not to disrupt the school unless it is absolutely necessary. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I hope I answered your question, Alicia.
Thank you very much to every single one of our panelists. Today it was very, very packed. We have some questions still, but I do apologize for those that we did not get to. So thank you very much for making this session too very productive. I look forward to seeing more great things that you all have to offer. So now we roll into session 3.